Hello, Mr. Chip McCarthy, who is running for the position of Cherokee County Sheriff. I'm Trenton Adams, and welcome to the Cherokee County Republican Party candidate interviews. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your campaign to participate in this interview process. We've extended this invitation to all candidates in this race and sourced questions from the CCRP membership. We have found that it has been an asset for voters in making their decision. The video will appear on the Cherokee County GOP website and will be shared on social media. The interview will be shown unedited in its entirety. For the interview, we will ask you a number of questions but can offer no prompting. There is no right or wrong answers, just your answers. We ask each candidate the same questions. If this is all right with you, I'll have everyone introduce themselves, and then I'll ask John to start asking the questions.
That's fine, thank you.
I'm John. I'm
Tim Adderholt. Harry Abrams.
Under which branch of government is the sheriff, and what do you believe the sheriff's role and relationship is with the other two branches of government?
Well, let's see. It falls under it's constitutional, so I would call it under the legislative branch of the government because it's not judicial, and so I would assume that was what it would be under. So what was the other part of the question?
Would you like me to repeat? Okay.
Repeat it, please.
Under which branch of government is the sheriff, and what do you believe the sheriff's role and relationship is with the other two branches of government?
Its role is to communicate with the other sides and to deal with their issues, to bring them forward and to bring forward issues that belong to, in law enforcement, for instance, bring that issue forward to those people to see where they can assist and work with them to achieve the mutual goals of all people concerned, all people in government.
What types of gun control laws and legislation do you support?
The main gun control law I support is constitutional carry. I think that anyone that legally can possess a firearm, not a convicted felon or committed domestic violence, should be allowed to carry a firearm or have it possess and carry a firearm without having to go through a permit process or training process. I think it is incumbent that they do get proper training and they do know how to use it, but I don't think it's the government's responsibility to enforce it or to bring that information forward.
Please explain your position on the issue of citizens filming police officers in public.
I welcome citizens filming officers in public. I think it's a good chance for them to see what's going on, to actually understand the realities of what goes on in law enforcement, to see how the officer acts, to see what their reactions may be to different stimuli, and really to give the public a better understanding of what law enforcement is exposed to. I think with the current spate of videos that are out there, that law enforcement officers are now seeing their own actions be called into question for legitimate reasons, but likewise to see some of the citizens' reactions called into question and actually support law enforcement.
Why is the Marshal's Office a distinct entity from the Sheriff's Department?
My understanding is the Marshal's Office does duties not normally relegated to the Sheriff's Office. That includes the 911 Center, animal control, and other code enforcement issues. So it does have a different responsibility where the Sheriff's Office handles the courtrooms, the courthouse, handles warrant service, and handles generalized patrol. So it is a totally different entity and has totally different responsibilities, and I think that's the reason it is separated from them.
The Marshal's Office is tasked with enforcing noise ordinance violations which typically occur during those hours the Marshal's Office is closed. Would you push to have this incorporated as a mutually applicable law rather than a separate jurisdiction issue?
My understanding is since it's a county ordinance violation, it would fall under the Sheriff's Office anyway after hours. However, if you wanted to quell that problem, then the thing to do would be to put some of the marshals on different hours so that they could actually do enforcement during the times that it does apply. So the answer to your question is I think it already does fall under the purview of the Sheriff's Office. It's just not readily enforced because they're handling other duties, but they can enforce it if they need to.
Paragraph 8 of the Georgia Constitution states, searches, seizures, and warrants. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue except upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place or places to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Please describe the difference between a reasonable search and an unreasonable search.
All right, in the case you've just cited, a reasonable search is one that is based on probable cause, meaning that you have a preponderance of the evidence to believe that you have a crime that has been committed. So without that preponderance of the evidence to be able to make that decision, then you can't make the search. Now, there are different things that qualify. To give you an example, if you're arrested for DUI, I have the right to search for intoxicants of that. Likewise, if I'm doing an inventory of the vehicle, then I have the right to search to make sure I've secured all the valuables in the vehicle. Therefore, specifically what you're talking about has to do with warrants and being secure in your papers. There are exceptions to it depending on the movement of vehicles and that kind of thing. But overall, if they're, when in doubt, get a warrant.
Are you currently up to date with all post certifications, and what are they?
If you're asking, am I currently post-certified and currently available to be a police officer, the answer is yes. I have the minimum of 20 hours per year. In my case, I had to do chief executive training since I was the chief of police, so I am up to date on that as far as up to the time I retired from my position in Fairburn. Therefore, I am done with that. I am currently, I think I've even exceeded the 20 hours at this point, but I plan to get more training before the year is out anyway to make sure I qualify. Plus, I have to do firearms and use of force. So that by the end of the year, I'll be completed.
Thank you. Are you currently employed by a law enforcement agency?
No, sir. I just retired about 4 weeks ago.
Have you attended and been certified by the FBI Academy?
Yes, I have been. I went to the FBI Academy, but I also went to the FBI Leads, which is a law enforcement executive development seminar, which is specifically designed for large law enforcement agencies. FBI National Academy is designed for supervisors and managers. Leads is a step up from that. Also, as far as that kind of management kind of training, I've also been to the Carl Vinson Institute's Management Development Program, which is through the University of Georgia.
When was the last training event that you attended, and please describe it?
The most current training event I attended was the Winter Georgia Chiefs Conference in Augusta, and that included all sorts of training regarding agency heads, including liability, crime scenes, the Boston bombing, and some of the other things that go along with that, current updates on laws. So that was in January, was my most current. Of course, I've had some other training like firearms, that kind of thing, but that was my most current training.
As Cherokee County residents, if we ask your current or last supervisor, which area of your work ethic needed the most improvement, what will we learn?
Well, my work ethic, there was never any question, so I'm assuming that he would tell you that my work ethic was not a problem. So I don't think that he has any questions about that. As a matter of fact, I don't think he wanted me to leave when I left, and my mayor told me that if I didn't get the position, he'd be glad to let me take a leave of absence so I could come back. So I'm assuming that my work ethic satisfied the mayor and the city manager, so I don't think there is anything that would be questionable about it.
If you could start your career over again, what would you do differently?
I think I would probably spend more time learning how to deal with people more closely, to deal with the people under my control. I think I would have started that earlier instead of waiting till later, because I think it's very important, especially now with millennials and some of the younger officers. You've got to know what they're doing. You've got to understand what their feelings are and why they're doing the things the way they do it. And early in my career, I wish I'd had that kind of training, and I didn't have it.
Would you support releasing inmates who are awaiting trial based on their risk to the community instead of whether or not they can post bail?
If you're asking if I would allow them to be released on their own recognizance, depending on the severity of the crime, the answer is yes. We've done that in the past. I have no problem with it. As long as they're not a threat to society, I don't see a problem with letting them sign their own bond. Obviously, they have to adhere to the conditions of the bond. If they fail to adhere to those conditions, then they need to be taken back off the street and then a cash bond be posted to ensure their compliance.
What are your thoughts on the federal government passing laws providing for the control of privately owned firearms?
I think the federal government, more times than not, has overstepped its bounds, and I think that the Supreme Court has decided that some of the things that involve interstate commerce really don't. I think that the federal government, for the most part, has overstepped most of it, to include the most recent attempt to ban the steel core ammunition for AR-15s. I think they continue to do it, and they will do as much as they get the chance to thwart your ability to purchase or control your own firearms and your own destiny, and I'm against it.
What is your plan to rid our county of illicit drug makers and traffickers?
The plan is the same whether it's drug traffickers or illicit drug users. Most of the time you're going to find that these people commit the same crimes over and over again. They have a tendency to be career criminals. They have a tendency to do the same things, and therefore you can target them. If you know who these people are, which you do because you've got arrest records, you've got home records, you know what kind of cars they drive, the thing to do is to make sure when you see these vehicles and these people on the street that you watch them more closely. I'm not saying you should make an illegal stop or anything, but you should observe what they're doing. If they commit a violation, then you need to stop them and find out what's going on. And what you do is basically force them to go elsewhere to commit their crimes.
What is your plan to address and prevent human trafficking within Cherokee County?
The only way to deal with human trafficking is to find it, to find out where it's occurring, and then deal with the individuals that hopefully will communicate with you. But a lot of these people have a tendency not to communicate because they're here illegally already and have a tendency not to want to talk, so you've got to make them feel comfortable. That includes bringing in people from their own communities, whether it be the Asian communities or the Hispanic communities, wherever they may be from, and try to establish a rapport ahead of time. Because if you establish a rapport ahead of time, you now have a foundation. They understand they can trust you, and they're willing to come forward, and then you can find the people that are actually bringing them in and actually putting them into what's glorified slavery.
Do you consider it unethical to promise anyone a position in the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department to garner support for your election?
Absolutely. There should be no promises made, and I've listened to a number of people talk about the fact that they haven't made promises, and that's not the truth. I have made a promise to no one. I think what a leader should do, specifically a sheriff, is should come into the organization, find out what is going on in the organization, who is doing what, find out whether or not they're best suited for the job. If they are, leave them where they are. If they're not, try to find a place to put them that might best benefit the agency and the county. I'm the only person that doesn't have any preconceived notions on who's where in the agency. I don't know any. I know them, but I don't know them closely enough to be able to make favoritism or bring anybody in. In my last job, I brought no one in to the city of Fairburn, where I was the chief of police, that I knew from my other county or from the city of Atlanta that I knew. I brought no one in and went solely by what my hiring board decided, not by what me as the chief, what I as the chief chose to do.
Would holding annual or biannual public sheriff town hall meetings be rewarding for the county?
Well, biannual, I'm assuming you mean every 6 months. I would assume that you would want to do it either monthly or quarterly. And I think it'd be very, very beneficial because you get to see how other people look at what the sheriff's office does and what the current problems are and what the current feelings are. The thing about that, really, it should be a day-to-day activity instead of finite set times like that. But obviously that gives people an open forum to be able to come forward and discuss it. So I think it'd be very beneficial to the sheriff's office and to the community.
What actions would you take, if any, a federal agency did not notify the county sheriff's department of a forced property seizure or conducted operations in the county without prior notification? Does a sheriff have a role in defending individuals in the county from improper federal overreach?
I'll answer your last question first. The sheriff is the only entity, the sheriff's office is the only entity that can prevent federal overreach inside a county. The answer to your question is, if I find out after the fact that they've come in and done some seizure without notifying us, because of the relationships I have with people in the FBI, DEA, and some of these other organizations, I would find their SAC or their person in charge, their special agent in charge, discuss the problem with them and tell them in the future they better not come in here without letting somebody know what's going on. I had an experience in Sandy Springs when I was working there where the DEA came in and basically had a gunfight in a parking lot, packed up all their toys and left and never let anybody know they were there. We just got a bunch of calls, come and find a bunch of shell casings, and everything was gone. It was not appreciated by the chief then. I would not have appreciated. I was not high enough in the rank structure to be able to deal with it, but it became very, very testy. It was one of those deals that had to be resolved through communication with the agency heads.
Okay.
Differing from a law enforcement response to an immediate danger to life or property, no-knock search warrants allows for immediate breach of entry into a home, even though not specifically authorized by OCGA 17-5-27. Do you support the use of no-knock search warrants in Cherokee County? And if so, under what circumstances would you use a no-knock warrant?
All right, no-knock warrants, the federal government has said they're legal. Georgia state law says that they're prohibited. So the answer to your question is, I believe that there are circumstances when a no-knock warrant is warranted. Now, what the current law says that you will knock and announce your presence prior to going in. I think that law enforcement has to announce their presence. The problem you have with no-knock warrants is if I'm secure in my household knowing that I have not done anything wrong, then I'm going to assume that I'm being breached by someone that's not law enforcement, assuming I'd be secure in my papers in my house. So the no-knock warrants need special scrutiny, and I've discussed this before. The judge is probably not the best person to make that scrutiny. The judge is going to weigh the facts that are given to him or her at the time. It is incumbent upon the supervisor or manager, and preferably somebody in the command staff, to make a decision on whether or not that no-knock warrant is justified, to do a total review of it and make sure that it qualifies as endangering the police officers that are involved. Like if somebody's got weapons, for instance, somebody that's a fugitive says, I'm not going to be taken alive, then your goal is to surprise them before they have a chance to react and take action against the law enforcement officer. As a general rule, I don't think no-knock warrants are really valid for stuff like drugs, because somebody may flush them down. You can get in there quick enough not to have to worry about that too much. But as far as if there's weapons cases where a law enforcement officer's life is in danger, I do support no-knock warrants. I know that's contrary to a bunch of most libertarian type people, but I don't see any choice around it as far as the safety of the officers are concerned. But again, I think as part of being the sheriff, my job is to scrutinize the supervisor or manager that approved that warrant. And I think that my job is to tell them, you need to make sure that it's correct, and if you have a question, you let me know what your concerns are, and then we'll deal with it from there. Because it is a very, very dangerous situation, and it has a great potential for errors and missteps by law enforcement.
Civil forfeiture involves the government taking property that belongs to a citizen upon reasonable suspicion. To regain property from the government, a citizen must prove the innocence of both themselves and the property being seized in opposition to the presumption of innocence. And the seizing party is allowed to directly profit from items seized via civil forfeiture. States of Minnesota and New Mexico have passed laws to permit asset forfeiture only in cases of a conviction. Do you agree with this? Why or why not?
The answer to your question on asset forfeiture only on conviction, I think you ought to be allowed to seize the assets based on probable cause, not reasonable suspicion, meaning their crime has been committed. I agree that they should be held until a conviction is had for all or part of the charges, and then a decision be made by a judge as to whether or not those assets were part of the criminal act, and then to seize them. So it's a multi-step process. I think the actual seizure of the asset can be done on probable cause, that the actual taking of the asset, meaning converting it to the use of the agency or to wherever the government, has to be done based on a conviction, and then whatever the judge decides is a fruit of that crime or a fruit of the charges that have occurred can then make the decision on whether or not those assets are part of that.
A member of Cherokee County's legislative delegation has submitted legislation, HB 832, which states, the court shall stay civil forfeiture proceedings during the pendency of criminal proceedings resulting from a related indictment or accusation until such time as the criminal proceedings result in a plea of guilty, a conviction after trial, or an acquittal after trial, or are otherwise concluded before the trial court. As sheriff, would you support civil asset forfeiture before or after due process and a criminal conviction?
Well, I think it goes back to the original question you just asked me, and that law, I think, is almost identical to what I'm talking about. We can seize the asset, again, I think based on probable cause. Once there is a conviction, then you should be able to seize the assets, again, whatever the judge determines. If there's a finding of not guilty, then I think the assets should be given back to the individual that they were taken from.
Bills have been introduced to allow Leo to ask for carry permits of anyone carrying a sidearm. While currently not passed in Georgia, if such a law were to pass, would you, as a policy, prohibit your deputies from asking for permits solely on the basis of carrying?
I would tell my deputies that they were to enforce the law. If the law allowed them to make that inquiry, then I would think that that would be legal for them to do, and I would not prohibit it. My problem with it is it falls very similarly to driver's licenses. I cannot arbitrarily stop a car on the road and ask for a person's driver's license, even though they have to have a driver's license to drive on the road. So therefore, I would be hesitant to allow them to go out and ask somebody for a permit without some type of reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed, because to me it falls under the same thing as a driver's license. It scares me a little bit as far as law enforcement is concerned to see weapons out there that you don't know if the person is a convicted felon or not. But to me, you have to have that reasonable suspicion to go that next step. So I would not tell them they could not enforce it, but I would tell them they should use all due regard, with the understanding that, in my opinion, that it falls under the same thing as a driver's license and therefore becomes a problem. And likewise, if you go to constitutional carry, it doesn't matter.
Do you believe that body cameras would effectively solve the problem they are proposed to solve?
Not even close. Body cameras are a myopic view of what's going on. They only show one side of it. And if there's not more than one camera, and I've seen some videos where one camera from one person sees one thing, but a camera from another person happens to see it. If that other person wasn't there, then there could be a problem. So cameras open up a whole lot more questions than they do answers. Generally, what they will help in is the he said, she said type situation. It might be okay in some use of force issues. The problem is they don't get the full view that you would have with your eyes. They don't get a full, smells, sights, sounds. They don't pick up everything. So there will be a whole lot of questions. The problem with cameras and that kind of technology is the expense with it. The cameras themselves are not the cheap part. It's the retention of data and then the reproduction of data for attorneys and or any other request that comes across. So there's a number of problems with it, and without some legislative changes, it will cause more problems than it will solve.
Are you currently a member of the Cherokee County Republican Party?
Yes.
You can go with that.
Okay.
Go for it.
We would like our elected Republican leaders to help us grow the party. Please briefly describe any significant efforts you have made in the past to support the Republican Party and or the Republican candidates locally, statewide, or nationally.
Okay, running for a position is kind of hard for me to support people locally. I do get involved in the national elections somewhat by talking to my relatives, friends, but as a law enforcement officer, it's kind of hard to get out there and tout one particular thing because it may reflect negatively on my ability to do my job. To me, the key to the Republican Party is the youth. Without the younger folks getting involved, we've got a severe problem. It's just like in my church. If you don't have young folks coming in, the church dies. The same thing with the Republican Party. We've got to show them what they can benefit from as far as the organization is concerned, try to show them that we can benefit them and they can benefit us, and show them that we are the party of personal civil rights, personal constitutional rights, limited government. If we don't show that, then we're going to continue down this path we're going now, where we're severely in debt and not being able to dig out of it. So I actively do that. I do talk with a number of people at my church, especially kids, because I'm involved in youth. We discuss a lot of the political issues. Not as a politician, I try to give them both sides, and I try to tell them, look, don't take my word for it, please do your research, but here's what I've noticed, and then you can make your own judgment from there. So I try to make them think for themselves, but I do want them to know that there's another side other than what they see on television.
And I'll take the last tough two. Have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime excluding traffic offenses?
No.
And have you ever been the subject of professional discipline or cited for breach of ethics or unprofessional conduct by any board, disciplinary committee, court, administrative agency, or other professional group?
No.
Well, thank you very much. If there's anything else you'd like to say to those watching the interview.
Nope. I'm Chip McCarthy. Please vote for me for sheriff, and hopefully you'll find that I'm a constitutional conservative, one that represents you and the people that you live with and the people you work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.